Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a CPA that's worked in the investment and financial services industries. I've also started multiple companies that have achieved millions of dollars in revenue, and I've sold companies with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find out more about my background at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter, a Holland Podcast. That's a Holland Podcast to join us in conversations that we have every week outside of the podcast. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, to get the weekly updates when we post the video version every week. Thank you so much for joining us each and every Wednesday to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, last week in episode 24, we introduced the concept of the differences between traits and talents, understanding how those two are interconnected, personality traits and talents, but how they're also different. And we gave descriptions for them, and we used those as a foundation upon which to build. Specifically, today we're going to continue building on that foundation, and we're going to focus on using traits or understanding traits and analyzing traits for personal growth. One of the things about being a human is as you grow and you mature, ideally, you start to understand yourself better. You start to understand who you are from a personality trait perspective, not the talents that you've developed. Of course, you understand as you get older and you choose a career what your talents are and you make decisions about those. But I'm talking about, as we discussed in the previous episode, innately, what tendencies do you naturally revert towards? Personality traits. And as with all humans, but particularly for entrepreneurs, we are often forced to identify those traits more quickly as a business owner, as a leader, than you may otherwise would be throughout life. Of course, there are certain things throughout every human's life that mature them, and perhaps we have to face ourselves and realize that certain traits we have make life easier and other traits we have make life harder, whether that's in relationships, having children, in the workforce, dealing with challenging people, going through the various conflicts that life presents. Those things all cause us to take a step back and say, how do I get through this? If you're looking at a particular conflict. For me, in my experience, having started a business at a very young age, 23 approximately, with my business partner, Jeff, for guys at age 23, we're really immature. And if you're a guy and you don't want to admit that, I feel bad for you. Women, you've dealt with us enough that you know that that's absolutely true. And we typically don't tend to mature until 28, 29, 30, at least for most of us. And hopefully it's not any longer than that. So, what I found a real challenge starting a business at such a young age was I was forced to grow up very quickly. And in the context of what we're talking about, when I say grow up, what I had to realize very quickly, not only working with another human as a business partner, but also having employees, working with customers, I had to be honest with myself and identify my personality traits. And so I want to talk about 7 personality traits that I think are incredibly important for every entrepreneur, business owner, quite frankly, any leader to understand and to analyze within yourself. Think about being 23 or 24, which is what I was presented with, and managing a group of employees. They're looking to you for leadership. That's a challenge when you're so young and there's so many things in life that you haven't experienced. Now, as for all of us at any point in our life, it seems like as we get older and more mature, we look back 5 years, 10 years and say, wow, how could I have been so immature? How could I not have recognized that particular weakness? And when I say weakness in this scenario, I'm talking about a trait perhaps that you innately have that makes things more difficult for you or for others. And we slowly learn to cope with those. But the only way to do that is to identify them and then actively work on understanding those. Now, I've put personality traits thus far in this episode more in a negative connotation, but the reality is we all have traits that are positive in certain scenarios and are negative or make other scenarios very challenging. So, going back to what I was trying to talk about was being so young, being so immature and being thrown in to a scenario where you had to really look at each of these 7 traits that we're going to talk about and say, okay, is this something that I innately have, or is this something that I'm going to work on? Or, and again, traits are pretty hard to change because there are natural tendencies. That's not to say that you can't work on them, but they're what you naturally revert to. And so, if you don't have a particular one that's needed for a situation, hopefully you have a business partner that does. And that's the combination of the strengths and weaknesses that can make teams so great. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next episode is understanding traits to create effective and efficient teams. But focusing on personal growth, let's talk about the 7, and we'll just start with number 1 that we're going to go through today. And that is self-awareness. Now, self awareness is really, really the foundation for personal growth. It really involves recognizing and understanding your emotions, your strengths, your weaknesses, your values, and your motivations. And it's self awareness inherently is being honest with yourself about those things. I think as humans, whether in material situations or immaterial situations, we all struggle with, just because it's the natural sinful nature of man, sometimes deceiving ourselves or lying to ourselves about reality, particularly about who we are and what our traits are. And we're very quick to cast the blame on others when something goes wrong, when in reality, outside perspectives may be able to tell you that was really a result, that conflict that arose or that challenge that you had in a relationship or in a business was really a result of one of your weaknesses. And it's important for you to recognize that, acknowledge that, say sorry when required, or just understand, okay, that's something that I'm going to have to work on and deal with throughout whatever scenarios may be. Now, I'm being very vague and we can get into specifics, but I think for all of us who have lived a little bit of life, you have a good idea of what I'm talking about. And this old adage of walking a day in another person's shoes, I think very much goes to the topic of our first trait of self awareness. And I often wish that I could step outside of who I am and see how others view me, because that is a very effective way to be more self aware, to understand how your positive traits are helpful and contributory in certain situations, and how your negative personality traits actually result in more catastrophic situations or make things worse. And so I think being aware of your thoughts and your behaviors allows you to make intentional choices and develop strategies for self improvement where it's needed. And I can think of so many situations in business, and I'm sure you can too, and of course in life as well, where had I been just a little bit more self aware, the outcome of a particular scenario may have ended up more positive than it otherwise would have. This is so important in relationships. And relationships, of course, can be affectionate relationships, they can be business relationships, or they can just be friendships. And I think one of the biggest struggles that I had growing up in a business at a young age and being an entrepreneur and being looked to was this concept of self awareness. Because we all know that first impressions are huge, whether we like it or not. First impressions are really important, especially for your employees and especially for customers, really for anybody, but in the business context, for employees and for customers. And when you bring someone in to interview, you are, of course, making determinations on whether you believe they'll be a good fit for the team. But you can bet they're making assumptions or evaluations on whether you're someone that they would like to work for. And it needs to be a two-way street, and it's important that both of those evaluations go on. And so if you're not self-aware, perhaps a trait, I'm an extrovert. I'm more of a type A personality. And so sometimes I can come across as arrogant just because I'm naturally more confident. Now, that came with time and developing my gut, but I think from a natural personality perspective, that's who I am. And so there are situations where you want that confidence to be present and you want to be able to take a commanding lead. But there are also other times where if you don't keep, and again, I'm talking for me personally, and each one of us has to analyze ourselves to think about this self awareness and how it can impact various outcomes and situations. But for me, if I'm not careful in certain situations, that confidence can be perceived as boastfulness or arrogance, and it can result in people not wanting to be a part of your team or perhaps feeling overshadowed. And so when they have so much to offer or contribute, if they have maybe a little bit more timid of a personality, they may shy away from that. And that is why, as a business owner, it's so incredibly important to understand this concept of self awareness and how other people are viewing you. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about the importance of culture and that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Those CEOs that understand self awareness and actively practice being self aware and working on the thoughts and emotions that maybe present challenges for them or within the organization. They actively work on being mindful of them and either inhibiting them or altering them, not to be fake, but to only allow certain, again, the example that I brought up, that confidence is important in certain circumstances. There's other circumstances where you got to be able to take a step back. And I think that's only possible when you understand self awareness. This next one that I want to talk about is interesting because I think entrepreneurs almost inherently have this. And of course, we're talking in generalities, and these 7 personality traits that I think are really important for entrepreneurs to evaluate and constantly keep top of mind are important for everybody throughout life, I believe, and certainly in my experience, to be successful and to continue growing and improving and in learning. But the second one, a trait of openness to experience. I think we all know people who are more free spirited and free willed, and they're willing to try anything. Perhaps their risk tolerance level is far higher than other individuals. And they have this general aura of freedom and flexibility, openness to do different things. I think to encapsulate it, it really comes down to exploring new ideas, embracing change, and engaging in intellectual curiosity. Now, this is often, this openness to experience or trying new things is often conflicted and it's brought over to the morality side of things. And I want to be very clear that I am not talking about being open to changing your morals or your principles. And I think in this day and age, that is so easily, those two so easily, if you say your openness to experience, when I say that, I'm talking in a very strict technical perspective. I'm not talking about changing your morals, your principles to bend to the audience that you're talking to or something of that nature. I'm talking about embracing change, engaging in intellectual curiosity, really being willing to listen to other ideas and perspectives. That doesn't mean you have to change yours, nor should you, depending on the circumstance. But I want to make it clear that we're operating within the realms of morality and overall principles. So, this trait, if you focus on it, can help you expand your knowledge. It can challenge your assumptions. And one of the things that's so important in business, and I see having worked in many large organizations, this concept, again, we're talking about it in an individual, a singular manner as it relates to a human being, but it's also very much a cultural type of concept, openness to experience. So in these large organizations, the openness for change or challenge assumptions or the way they do things, as it gets larger, that's typically much, much harder to foster an environment of change and challenging assumptions so that you can constantly improve not only as human beings, but your products, your services, and stay ahead of the curve in your particular industry. So, just piggybacking on this, it's adapting to new situations, it's fostering, as it relates to personality traits, personal growth and development. This idea of being willing to try new things, have new concepts. I think one of the things that was interesting in the garbage company and being willing to think about a new experience or venturing into a new segment of the business was, as I've said in the past, we had an evolution within the waste services industry where we started in roll off, those huge containers. We quickly realized that didn't pay the bills. And so we had to evolve into something that was more consistent, recurring revenue, and that was picking up weekly trash for residential homes. And then we realized that there was an opportunity that we were missing out in a segment we were missing out in the commercial side of things. And while that was much more competitive, the margins were typically higher. And so it was less of a high volume, low margin game and more of a lower volume, high margin game. And that's generically speaking. You still had to focus on density, which was one of the key performance indicators in our industry. And we've talked about key performance indicators or KPIs in the past. But this concept of openness to new experience, and when you're looking at yourself, ask yourself, when someone brings up a new idea, is your immediate reaction no, or that's different, or that's change, or we can't do that because we've always done it this way? I know for me, that's something, particularly as I get older, I really struggle with. I really like my schedule. I really like not having a lot of change. And especially when technology is changing so quickly, the older I get, the more I have to be self aware and self reflective on this particular personality trait of not having my immediate response to anything different being no. And so whether it's in the construction business or whether it's the coffee and bike shop, when people bring up new ideas, I know that one of my weaknesses, if you will, as you get older, for me anyways, and I think this may be generally true, but I can only speak from my experiences. I have to hold myself from automatically having a kind of a negative connotation on a particularly new idea just because it's something new or something different. So, this one is really important for being able to be flexible in an incredibly dynamic economic workplace as we become more global. And at this point, we're basically very globally interconnected across the countries. And as technology continues to advance so rapidly, we had an episode a few episodes ago about AI. I think this concept and this personality trait and looking at yourself and being open to new experiences and I think more importantly, embracing change, because the one thing we know in life is change is certain, is one that if you can keep top of mind as you grow in your business and as your industry potentially changes, it's going to be easier for you to evolve as required. The next one I want to talk about is an interesting one because I think that it is one that's often missed and maybe I don't want to say dying in our society, but as we all become so inwardly focused with our cell phones and our technology, and so much of everything being our ability to give our opinions and basically project, whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, podcasts, where have you, conscientiousness, I think, has fallen to the wayside a little bit. And I think what the reason I'm highlighting these particular 7 traits, and there's so many different personality traits, but the reason I've picked these 7 is because in my experiences, both as an entrepreneur and working with other entrepreneurs, these 7 are really key to master. And conscientiousness is included for a very, very deliberate reason. So, what is conscientiousness? What do I mean by that? So, that involves being organized, responsible, diligent in your actions. I would say it includes qualities like being disciplined, goal oriented, reliable. That's something that really requires you to think about other people and how your actions have consequences for other people, not just for yourself. I think in general, conscientious individuals tend to be committed to thinking about other people, their personal growth, setting high standards for themselves, and working relatively diligently to achieve their goals, but also to be mindful of how their actions, again, being conscious, and this is similar to self aware, but it's a little bit different, uh, being conscious of how your actions have impacts on everybody else. And that's the one that I think is slowly being degraded in our society is whether it's everybody I talk to when we drive, no matter where it is. And I'm in the Phoenix metro area, so there's obviously a lot of cars and driving is crazy, but I think everybody feels that way where they live. So many times the perfect example of being conscious or being conscientious in the particular context in which we're using it when you're driving is understanding that for every action, or what's that science term, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that's a perfect example in this scenario. I think the other piece that is easy for some individuals and hard for other individuals is being organized, being responsible. Organization can be really, really challenging as a small business owner, especially when you're wearing 7 to 10 different hats. And as I've gotten into more businesses, oftentimes more than I should, and I focused on those around me, I've had the opportunity to identify, and we'll talk about this more another episode because it's important to identify personality traits within yourself, but it's also important to create effective teams to identify personality traits across the individuals that are really making your organization who they are, who is organized and who's not. Now, we're talking about conscientiousness. And so I think that's a much broader personality trait than just focusing on being organized and detail oriented. But I want to cover that topic under this particular trait because it does, or it is an important part of it. And for those of you who perhaps struggle with organization, and I would say that I do, but as I self reflect and I look at some of those around me, I'm learning that over time and because of some of the experiences that I've had, I'm getting better at that. Although some days I feel like I stuck my finger into a light socket, my hair is just exploding, and I'm the most unorganized person in the world. But I think part of being conscientious is whether it's a strength of yours, organization and detail orientation or not, it's really key to have some modicum of this because it will make your life easier, but it also will it is a reflection people can see, people around you can see whether you're a hot mess, if you will, especially if you're in a position of leadership, as many entrepreneurs are as they grow their team and with customers, and as they become more well known throughout society, depending on the different positions that they're in or different doors that are open as a business owner. People will view this and they generally can get a good idea of whether you're responsible, whether you're conscientious, whether you're detail oriented, whether you're reliable. And so, for any individual wanting to grow their business, you're going to have to work with vendors, you're going to have to work with customers, you're going to have to work with employees. Uh, this concept of being conscientious and being mindful of it and working on it is really an important one to help foster the success throughout your organization. The next one is, I have it number 4 that we talk about, but it is one that conscientiousness I talked about being pretty far gone in society. This one I think is gone in society, and this is the hardest, the one that I have to work on constantly, every single day. And as we're humans, I've talked about this in the past. Generally speaking, as humans, we have highs and lows. As entrepreneurs, we tend to have higher highs and lower lows, and they tend to happen in much more frequency. You can have one week and you can have 100 highs and 100 lows, whereas in an average person's life, let's say they're not running a business or not working to be an entrepreneur. And that's not to say that there aren't jobs out there. Certainly, the president is very probably similar and has many, many challenges similar to an entrepreneur, perhaps many more, and ones with far more consequences when you think about economy, national security, etc. But as entrepreneurs, we tend to have high highs, low lows, and they come very quickly, all within 1 week. And so, emotional intelligence is the 4th personality trait that I want to talk about. And this is a personality trait that I think some people are innately more capable of and other people are less capable of. But I believe that out of all the ones that we talk about in this day and age is probably the most important one that, number one, can be most easily altered, which is a good thing because, as we've said, traits are our general tendencies, our natural go tos, and they're often enduring over time and hard to change. This one, I believe, is changeable, more changeable than some of the other ones we're going to talk about, and quite frankly, than a lot of personality traits. But it requires an incredible amount of deliberate and intentional work to improve. Emotional intelligence, dare I say, is gone in our society. So, what is emotional intelligence? Well, to briefly put it, encompasses the ability to recognize, understand, manage your emotions and the emotions of others. You have to have skills like self regulation, empathy, social awareness, and effective communication. I want to reiterate that because those terms, self regulation, similar to self awareness, but self regulation is uh, only really can come when you have self awareness, being able to control yourself. Empathy, I think a huge part of emotional intelligence is being able to empathize and sympathize where you're able to with other individuals. And we'll talk about how can you get better on emotional intelligence or keep it top of mind. Social awareness, very similar to self-awareness, but again, in this day and age with media, social media, it's so key. And then effective communication. We're going to have a whole episode at some point on communication because I think communication, which is a part of this emotional intelligence, is also uh, something that is gravely lacking in general. And I'm saying so many of these things in society are gravely lacking as if I'm a pessimist, but that's not the case. But again, I'm a big believer that the degradation of society has occurred because of the rapid advancement of technology. And so there are huge opportunities to be had for entrepreneurs and business owners who identify these things, identify the skills and the capabilities that are lacking, the personality traits, and capitalize on them. And so we're not only talking about these particular traits because I think it makes for a more meaningful human experience, a more enjoyable human experience. It can help prevent conflict, but because when you identify them and you capitalize on them, there are huge opportunities to be had. And the majority of people go into business for that exact reason. They want to grow something and they want to, generally speaking, have the freedom to create the American dream and financial success. Emotional intelligence is probably, as I've said, one of the most important traits out of all the ones we're going to talk about, the most important trait, I would likely say, where the greatest number of opportunities and doors can be open if you master this one. And it's impossible for any to master this one because we all have highs and lows, we have good days and bad days, but you can get a lot better at it. So if you can work on developing your emotional intelligence, you can enhance your self awareness, you can improve your interpersonal relationships. And again, what this whole podcast is about is overall personal growth. So, we've given it generic conversation, what generic description of emotional intelligence, but it really is the ability, no matter in what circumstance, for you to control your emotions. You can't control the emotions of those around you, although talking about self awareness and some of the other things, you can understand how, if you are self aware, some of the things you do can have an impact on how other people react. But you can always, always control your emotions. And in this day and age where we get everything so quickly, at the snap of a finger because of technology. And I keep coming back to that, and it's important because I see it. I've been in business for long enough. I've worked with enough employees. I've seen it with customers, and I've experienced a wide array of individuals across all different spectrums, political spectrums, personality spectrums, socioeconomic spectrums. And some of these themes that I see intertwined throughout are all related to the impact that technology has had and the overall resulting impact it's had on us as a society, us as human individuals and our traits. And so, this emotional intelligence is about patience, it's about self control. And because, as I've said before, technology tends to, and I'm not a scientist, but I believe there are many studies that show this or are proving this, that our neural networks seem to be getting shorter and our ability, our paths to reason and logic, because everything is at our fingertips and we can get it in the blink of an eye, that has an impact on our ability to control our emotions. And so while I would argue over 100 years ago, people were generally had a better control over their emotions, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I can't blame it all on technology, but let's just focus on that. Today, because I believe technology is actually scientifically changing our ability to logic and reason, in the sense that when we can get everything in the blink of an eye, when we can respond to a text in a matter of 30 seconds, we expect other people to, and when it doesn't happen, we get angry or we get frustrated. That's why emotional intelligence is so important in the 21st century, because everything around us is happening so quickly and available so much, but that doesn't mean that your reactive time as it relates to being able to control your emotions should do the same. And there are so many examples in business where emotional intelligence is incredibly important. When we were negotiating the sale of Proviro Waste Services, our garbage company, I was across the aisle and negotiating with one of our local competitors, who I would argue, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most emotionally intelligent person that I've ever worked with, and 1 being the least emotionally intelligent person who probably didn't have one single clue what that word even meant and didn't care about their emotional control. This individual was probably on a level 1.5. And so for me, it took an incredible amount of emotional intelligence to get through that whole process. The benefit of doing that was, I believe, we got everything we wanted and more. So we were really able to dictate the terms, if you will. And it wasn't just because of the discrepancy in what I would argue was the emotional intelligence, but there were other circumstances as well, within the marketplace, opportunity to sell to other individuals, etc. But this concept of controlling your emotions can directly result in your ability to accomplish a tremendous amount, or your ability to fail at a tremendous amount of activities or actions. I think we see this in Congress. I love politics. I don't bring politics up very much in this podcast, but I want to start bringing it more because it's something I'm very passionate about. It's something I really enjoy. And as importantly, it is so interconnected with business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. But when I look at Congress, when I look at the political atmosphere that we currently exist in, emotional intelligence is completely gone from both parties, from all systems. It just doesn't exist. And sadly, bringing it back to technology, I believe that has exacerbated the far extremes. And those far extremes are almost the very definition of the lack of emotional intelligence, because you're going for a certain response, you're going for a certain action, you're trying to get a rise out of your competitor because that tends to grow audiences and grow following. Because for some reason, we as natural sinful human beings respond to the extremes. People can argue that that's not true. It's absolutely true. If you're self aware and you're honest with yourself, if you get a poll about something you feel really strongly about, you're more likely to respond than if it's something that's kind of milk toast lukewarm. That's why emotional intelligence in this day and age, across all industries, across all facets of life and society, is waning. But it's why it's at the top of my list. Because if you can work on this, and I work on it constantly, daily. I've told you that my brother and I are in business together, and we're very interconnected. As with just business ownership in general, it can be a struggle as a business partner. But when your lives are so interconnected, you really have to work on it. I know some days he wants to kill me, and other days I want to kill him. But emotional intelligence and being mindful of working on it helps us accomplish the goals that we're looking to do. And we have our good days and bad days like everybody does. That's part of being human. And to try to pretend that you're not going to have bad days is, of course, ridiculous. But I think what's important is for you to apologize and say sorry when it's required, and for you to give leeway and sympathy and empathy to other people when they're having bad days. And that's all part of this emotional intelligence. And so, the more as an entrepreneur and a small business owner that you can master this, when working with challenging employees, when working with challenging customers, when working in challenging conflict oriented situations, not only will you achieve incredible results or have the propensity to achieve incredible results, but people around you will recognize it. And that is a very attractive feature for working with other businesses and for business growth. When I identify someone that I say that person is actively thinking about emotional intelligence, deliberately working on it, and none of us are going to be perfect. But when I see that and I see that progression over time, that's someone that I want to do business with. And I know that's someone that I want to partner up with or help with. The opposite is true. When you see people, and we see this in politics all the time, people that just fly off the hip and people that don't have 2 seconds of emotional intelligence, it's very off putting. And quite frankly, while you can have incredibly solid uh, opportunities or objectives and you can be good at them. I think former President Trump, and obviously the leading Republican candidate right now, this is one of those areas where if he just had a tiny element of emotional intelligence about him, his level of effectiveness would go from, 5 to 5,000. But he hasn't learned this and he hasn't developed this. And I so wish he would, but because a lot of people across the aisle believe the policies were overall good for the country, but this inability to have any level of emotional intelligence for him, I think has just been so debilitating for his ability to accomplish his overall objectives. And that's not the only thing, but I think that's so applicable to now. Emotional intelligence, I could talk for this on this one about for 35 minutes, give you tons of examples, but every single day, I kid you not, I struggle with this. I think about it. I have my good days, I have my bad days. But what's important is I'm honest about it. And I know that the more I work at it, the better I get. And I've seen the actual results of working on it and maturing over time and getting better at it. Number 5 personality trait. This is one that, yes, it's pretty inherent, but I think you have to, it's really mental toughness and focus, and it's resilience. I think resilience is obviously the capacity to bounce back from setbacks, adapt to challenges, and maintain a positive outlook. I think sometimes it involves coping mechanisms, embracing growth mindsets, persevering in the face of adversity. It's kind of a cliche, but it's very, very true. And I don't think that anybody can be successful in business if you don't have resilience. We've had whole episodes of podcasts about failures and why you should pray for failure and how you learn so much for failure. But if you're not resilient, those failures do you no good. And so you really have to work on being resilient. I'll tell you, the older I get, and I don't, the tougher it is to be resilient. When I was younger, I could physically, and I don't want to say mentally. I think my mental acuteness and my mental ability has gotten much stronger through maturity and through living life a little bit more. That doesn't mean it's not still a struggle, but you just get exhausted. You just get physically and often more easily mentally exhausted as you get older. And that's part of the aging process. And so, this concept of resilience can be a lot more challenging. I think the other piece with this, especially when you're talking about failures, whether you've had a business failure, maybe you had to claim bankruptcy because something happened, and perhaps we'll have a whole episode on the concept of bankruptcy. But it as you get older and time moves on, it can be harder from a financial perspective to be resilient, but you can't let that get in your way. Resilience is the key to being able to have success no matter what business you're in. And I know I'm saying that about so many of these things, but it really is. I've picked these 7 traits for a very deliberate reason, and they're very interconnected. And if you can master all of these traits, and no one ever will, and anybody that says they uh, can is basically proof that they're not mastering these traits, because that's part of the human struggle. But if you can master these traits, resilience included, the foundation and opportunity for you to be successful is incredible. And again, when I talk about success, as it relates to this, I'm talking about from a secular perspective. So we don't need to talk a lot about resilience. I think that we all basically have a good idea of what does that mean. Working on it and actually achieving it in reality is hard, but step number 1 is identifying it. And if you're generally a person that has a negative outlook on life, this particular trait is going to be a challenge for you. If you generally think that your glass is half empty, resilience can be really tough. And so you're going to have to work harder on your mindset than someone who, generally speaking, has an optimistic glass half full type of mentality. I, generally speaking, am a very optimistic individual. And so this resilience is far easier than for other people that I've met throughout my personal and business and professional life. But often that side of things, when you're relatively optimistic, your naivete can increase, and perhaps your risk tolerance is not as it's too high, and that has certainly caused failures for me. So Resilience can really help you navigate the obstacles and the setbacks, while focusing on that personal growth and the emotional well-being concept. But it's important to identify it, and if you're someone that generally maybe is less optimistic, you're going to have to work a little bit harder on this one than others. Although in business, failures are failures are failures, and they're hard for every human, but they're a reality. So resilience is key. Number 6 is pretty similar to self awareness. Um, it's self reflection. That's number 6 on my list of really important traits. That's the practice of being introspective, examining your thoughts, your actions, experiences, looking back on certain scenarios and say, okay, how did my actions contribute to that positive or negative outcome? We tend to focus on the negative, and that's why we work on these traits generally, because when positive things happen, we just keep doing those things. But when negative things happen, it's an opportunity to be introspective, to be reflective, and figure out, why did this happen? And so this concept of self-reflection really involves critically assessing your own strengths, as we're talking about, your weaknesses, and where you need to improve to achieve the objectives you're trying to accomplish. I think regular self reflection allows you to learn from your experiences, make the adjustments necessary, although it's not going to happen overnight. Few few good things do, and as I always tell my nieces and nephews, patience brings good things to those who are willing to wait for it and those that work on it. But so making those adjustments and then continually growing as an individual through that self reflection process. For me, this is one that, as I get into business more and you have more experiences, I think it becomes easier to be self reflective. I think that's also a natural part of maturing in life and getting older. Although there are plenty of adults where I would say that's not the case. So perhaps I'm wrong on that front. But I think this concept of being self reflective is one where you have to take time to do it, even if you're wearing 10 different hats. Because if you don't, it makes identifying all these other personality traits that we've talked about almost impossible, particularly emotional intelligence. I don't believe that you can work on emotional intelligence without having self awareness, without having the ability for self reflection and being introspective. And when you're working on this, it's important for you to assess how you view a situation or kind of look inwardly. But ask your friends, ask your employees, ask people around you. Some of the best organizations that I've worked with or I've seen be successful from a cultural perspective find a way for this self reflection to occur, but then they also take it to the next level where they ask your peers, perhaps in an anonymous setting, so that you can get uh, true and accurate opinions without fear of retribution. Some people are less likely to share when they know that their name's attached to it. Some people don't have any problem with it. So the best organizations have feedback mechanisms where not only is it top down, but more importantly, it's bottom up. And they take a bottom up approach. And that, for me, when I ask people or where I've participated in those types of surveys, if you will, or analysis, where I can get feedback from other people about what I'm doing well, what I'm not doing well, that really helps me with my self-reflection reflective process. And quite frankly, it helps me be more self-aware. It helps me work on emotional intelligence. Again, all of these things are interconnected. And I think when you're self reflective and when you take feedback from other people, you can incorporate that into your introspective process. And that will alter how you act in varying situations. And of course, you can never anticipate every possible circumstance that's going to arrive in your personal and professional life. And we're all presented with conflicts that are far more challenging than others, whether it's a loss of a loved one, whether it's a divorce, whether it's bankruptcy. The gambit goes on and on and on. Some are far more challenging than others. But as you work on these things and you utilize the self reflective process it'll become easier. And your natural tendency to react certain ways in various situations will become more natural. And when I say react, I mean in a from a positive perspective. Um, and so you can't get there without something like self reflection. This last one is a personality trait that our society adores. It's one that I don't have a problem with, but uh, in the sense that I exhibit it frequently, but that inherently, in and of itself, can be a problem, and that's assertiveness. I think as a business owner and an entrepreneur, you need to be assertive, but you need to know when to be assertive and when not to be assertive. So, assertiveness involves expressing your thoughts and feelings, your needs in a direct but respectful, that's an important one, a respectful manner. It includes setting boundaries, advocating for yourself, effectively communicating your ideas, even in the midst of perhaps hostility. And sometimes that's the case. I think when you develop assertiveness, it can enhance your self confidence. I know it does, your decision making process, and your overall personal growth as an individual. I think, as I said at the top of this conversation on assertiveness, our society tends to adore people that are assertive, and that trait, that assertiveness, is generally combined with things like self confidence and, on the negative side, arrogance, whether perceived or actual. And so, those that are the most outspoken, who I would say are the most assertive, tend to get the most media coverage or tend to have the opportunity to be the most successful. For some reason, our society isn't particularly attracted to more shy or more timid individuals. But I think that if you look at leaders across the board, we have perfect examples of CEOs who were perhaps more type B. And I would say an introvert type B personality generally tends to be a little less assertive than a type A extrovert personality. But we've seen examples on both sides where someone who is that type B, less assertive, can be successful and they foster a certain culture. And as a matter of fact, I don't think we have enough of that culture, because typically assertive individuals can kind of close down the opportunity for creativity, embracing change, doing things a different way to adapt as required by market circumstances. Um, and of course, we've seen this is generally the norm. CEOs or businesses or entrepreneurs who are very assertive that are successful. I think a good example of someone who, at least from my perception of him, and I hope to have him on the podcast someday, is Elon Musk. I think behind the scenes, he's probably assertive where he needs to be, but I think he also embodies a sense of self reflection and maybe stepping back where necessary. Again, I've not worked with him in business, so I can't say that with 100% certainty, but just my take. And I read a lot about how he's accomplished the things that he's accomplished. And of course, I've read a lot of negative articles about him that would perhaps suggest alternatively. So I'll have to get him on the podcast and ask him myself. But I think he's one of those leaders where perhaps he knows, or he's assertive where he needs to be, but he can also take a step back and perhaps foster an environment of creativity. I really don't think you can do that. You can't uh, create an environment, or you can't have Tesla and SpaceX and some of the incredible inventions that he's come up with without having an environment of creativity and ability to embrace change, be dynamic, be flexible. And I think that's all tied in with this concept of assertiveness. So we've talked about 7 key traits, in my opinion, some of the most important traits, and there's a lot of them, but I picked these 7 for a reason, that not only on a human level are important to work on, uh, but from a professional perspective, the more you focus on these and think about them and keep them top of mind, the more opportunity you're going to have for success. And I believe that individuals around you are able to identify whether you exhibit these 7 traits and whether you're working on these 7 traits. And I believe that those who become the most successful leaders and the most successful business people. And of course, there are wildly successful business people that exhibit none of these traits or tend to exhibit very few of these traits. But I think the likelihood of you accomplishing the goals that you're trying to accomplish in business are much higher. The probability is much higher if you have a good handle on these traits: self awareness, openness to experience, conscientiousness, emotional intelligence, resilience, self reflection, and assertiveness. I can't always remember all of them, but I think that's a good concept or framework upon which all of us can think to can actively work on to improve outcomes in so many different scenarios. And I know for me, as I've grown and matured and as I've become more aware of these and I've worked on them, I get a lot more out of life. I get a lot more out of other humans. I think I've described this in the past. When I was younger, I was a pretty arrogant, overconfident, uh, kind of a jerk, I would put it. And I didn't really understand and see the value in other humans. And I don't mean that I didn't think human life was important. What I mean is I was always more likely to talk than to listen. And I always thought my idea was the best way. And I think just given my personality, those are weaknesses that I struggle with. But as I've grown and I've seen what teams can accomplish, and as I've taken step back and work on some of these parts of my personality, life has become more meaningful and far more fulfilling because you do tend to exhibit and experience the incredible, tremendous blessings that other people have to offer. And you only get to that point, especially for someone like me, a type A extrovert, confident personality, when you exhibit and work on these 7 traits. And this personal growth concept, it's a lifelong journey. I've said that multiple times, but it's something that you work on continually and you get better and you get better and you learn every day. I often look at my parents who are in their 60s, and at 36, I think, wow, uh, what can they possibly like? How do they feel about this world? And they've experienced so much, and how do these concepts impact them? And I think about any uh, anybody that is twice my senior, or we had Howard Ludwigson on. He was 80 years old, I believe. Just the wisdom and the experience that he exudes, just because of what he's been through in his life. And I think a lot of that boils down to these traits. Someone who's had the opportunity and the intellectual horsepower or the openness to understand these traits, to work on these traits. And oftentimes, life forces you to do these things. As I said, being young and being in business at such an early age, I was forced to really grasp these traits and focus on them and get better because I had a lot of, I would say, challenging circumstances that were self induced because of my naivete on these and because of my lack of self awareness and self reflection and emotional intelligence. But as an entrepreneur, you get thrown into these more quickly than perhaps the general society will be. And then for me, being so young, it made it even more challenging. But back to Howard or my parents and people who have lived and experienced so much more in life, I think there's so much that we, people in my generation and below, have to benefit from understanding the application of these traits and how you work on these traits because they've had the opportunity to do it and they can provide a lot of great advice and wisdom. So, point being, when you have the opportunity to spend time with people, your elders who have experienced more and are far more mature, especially when it comes to these concepts of these traits and personal growth, and had an opportunity of a lifetime or the opportunity throughout a lifetime to work on them, listen, take advantage of that. I know that those are my most cherished conversations when I just sit back, shut my mouth, and listen and ask questions to learn because they're incredible learning moments directly as it relates to these traits and personal growth. Well, that's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland podcast. I know we went in depth about these traits, but I think they're so important, not only for business, just about just for all relationships in life and for life in general. And the more you can work on these and be mindful of them and improve on them, the better life experiences you're going to have, and recognize the beauty in the simple things in life and your emotions and attitudes. If there's anything that you want to share or add to the commentary that we had this week, talking about traits and their importance in personal growth, reach out to me. You can email me on my website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Shoot me a tweet over Twitter. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. Enjoy all the conversations that we have outside the podcast there. So please participate, contribute. This podcast is only as good as we collectively make it. If you heard something on this podcast that sparked something and you're like, you need to have a podcast on this, let me know. If you liked what you heard, share it with people. I grow by you sharing with other people and saying, you know what, Andrew Holland had a good point. Listen to that podcast. The more we have in people contributing and listening, the more we can work on achieving the goal for which I set out in doing this podcast. And that's being a support group for everybody going through the challenges and opportunities of being an entrepreneur and a business owner. Remember, this is a podcast where sometimes we talk about legal advice, sometimes we talk about financial advice, whether it's investing or accounting. Don't ever take anything you hear on this podcast or any other podcast as the absolute gospel truth. Be sure you're always consulting the appropriate professionals in your area for your specific situation. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, @Holland Podcast. That's @Holland Podcast, for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.